All right. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another HR Heretics episode. Today we have Joelle Emerson. And Joelle, you've been running Paradigm now for like 10 years. Your client list includes some of the biggest names in tech. Can you tell our audience about Paradigm and the work that you all do?
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me. Really excited to chat with you both today. Paradigm offers a suite of products and consulting services that help organizations unlock the potential of their workforce by creating cultures where every employee can do their best work and thrive. So over the last, about decade since we got started, we've worked with more than 1,500 companies. And we really think about it as designing more representative teams, creating more fair talent systems and processes, and then helping organizations build more inclusive cultures that people feel more engaged, they perform better, and they stay.
Awesome. Oh, thank you so much for being here, Joelle. I'm a big fan of Paradigm. I've been working with you all and Natalie Johnson specifically for years. So it really stoked about this session.
Yeah, me too. Natalie says hi.
All right. So Joelle, in 2020, companies spent $7.5 billion on DEI programs. But a lot of the representation data for women and underrepresented minorities hasn't moved as much as I would have expected. Why aren't these numbers improving more quickly?
It's such an interesting question. And I have to say, it's a particularly interesting question in some ways, just given the moment that we're in right now and given the backlash that we're seeing to diversity and inclusion efforts. So on the one hand, one of the biggest critiques I see about this work is why aren't the numbers moving faster? Why aren't we seeing more progress? On the other hand, when companies make even moderate progress, they are now getting sued by extremist groups who are using that progress to falsely claim that, you must be engaging in illegal affirmative action because, you're making progress in these ways and we're seeing these numbers move. So it's just like an interesting moment where companies are sort of being attacked if they make progress, being, critiqued if they don't make progress. And I think the actual story of what's happening is a bit nuanced. So first, if we're trying to think about how an investment should map to outcomes, I think we have to talk about what are companies spending their money on. So, in many cases, if you look at those big investments that a lot of organizations, particularly in tech, made, a lot of those were efforts to, how I think about it, is efforts to sort of play a long game and increase representation in the industry overall, not so much short-term initiatives to grow their own representation. So, companies like Google and Microsoft made big investments in historically Black colleges and universities. IBM actually committed to funding, I think it was like cybersecurity centers at HBCUs. Adobe and other companies created some really interesting like apprenticeship programs to upskill talent from non-traditional backgrounds. And those are really cool investments. I just think they're not going to show up as immediate impact and representation numbers. They're probably like 10-year, or more investments in actually changing the funnel of talent into the industry. So I think that's just like a factor. And then I think you look at other things companies were spending money on that were more internal. And we know that organizations just are not always doing things that are evidence-based. Organizations are doing some things that are just like not likely to work. Like, for example, hiring a bunch of people with the title DEI that then sit a little bit separate from the business and have no accountability or even ability to influence hiring outcomes, or bringing in big training programs with sort of outdated like sensitivity type training or even outdated like bias training and putting everyone through a training that in a room once for 2 hours that no one then remembers, even if it's really good, a week later, 6 months later. So it's true that I think some of the areas that organizations have spent money are not things that are likely to move the needle on representation. Now, with all that said, like, I still think it's important to like share wins. And I think we actually are seeing progress, not as much as I would want, not as much as I think anyone that cares about this work would want. But I think if you're doing this work legally, if you're doing it thoughtfully, if you're doing it effectively, you're not going to see overnight or even like over the course of 3 years, massive changes to your representation. You're going to see changes in the kind of like few percentage points. And you can even see those in many companies in like 1 year. So, we worked with a consumer tech company that saw its representation of women in technology over the course of a year grow from 10 to 15%. Representation of women in leadership grow from 25 to 30%. Is that like, massive numbers that we should all take a victory lap around? No, but I think that's what it looks like to do this work effectively. If you're making sure people have fair access to opportunities, if you're designing processes that are more fair, I think you can see impact like that. I also think, when you zoom out, in aggregate and look at, across corporate America, I know we're, talk a lot about tech. We work with a lot of tech companies. We also work with a lot of companies in other industries. There was a study from Bloomberg not that long ago that found that in 2021, the S&P 100 increased its hiring rates of people of color like dramatically. Then I guess the last thing I would say is I think the premise of your question is all around representation, which is good and which is really important. But that's not the only thing companies should measure or that they even care about when it comes to this work. I think, who's doing the work matters, but also, are people doing their best work? Are people engaged? Are people productive? Are we getting more ideas from a broader set of people than we were before? And those are actually areas where I sometimes see the numbers change faster than representation, which tends to be a lagging indicator of all the things organizations might be doing to build better processes and healthier cultures. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'm just, curious to hear your perspective, is, while I don't think we've created yet a one-to-one correlation of spend $7.5 billion, see this impact on the economy, what I do know from, work with hundreds of companies is when organizations pause these efforts or stop doing things, we do see them backslide. And that's pretty measurable. We see it in terms of sentiment. We see it in terms of like promotion rates, hiring numbers, attrition. So even though I don't think we've totally perfected what this work should look like yet, and I think we should like have more dialogue and debate about what it should look like, I do know that when organizations stop, we see like all the same barriers that existed before just like pretty quickly reemerge. So yeah, but I know you two both work in this space. I'm curious for your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I have a question, Joelle. I feel like, I started really doing this work like 15 years ago. So like 10 years ago, I was like in it and working with you all. And I remember on panels and in our organizations, we were very clear, this is the long game. And our leaders would say that. And it is. I mean, it arguably never ends, but I feel like recently, and I know this headline, 7 billion and no ROI is kind of very blanket, but I feel like the industry's lost patience a bit. And I love your consideration set and all the companies you work with. Are you all seeing that and feeling that working with clients today? And how are you handling that if so?
Yeah, I think lost patience is, I hadn't thought about it that way, but I think that's a really good way to think about it, because I think if you're not finding ways to like show wins, and if it is such a long game, I think that's just something that the human brain is just not very good at managing. And so I do see that, but I think with the organizations we work with, we try really hard. And again, I wouldn't have put it in these terms, so it's really interesting how you said it. We try really hard to sort of like defend against that by giving organizations metrics that they should be moving towards, even if those aren't huge changes in representation. If you see a gap in sentiment between two different employee groups, what are you going to do to close that? And that's something that you should be able to measure success again, like, a year from now, not 10 years from now. So how do you create sort of more proximal outcomes, not these big picture, visionary, bold, we're going to, by 2040 look a whole different way, but these more near-term things we can measure so that people can feel like you're making progress. But I think that's hard. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, and I'm used to living in the enterprise SaaS world and in tech and in the valley here, and maybe I'm a bit jaded, but I'd love to hear, how do we compare to other industries? Like you mentioned, you work with a bunch of different industries. I'm sure there are differences, and I'd love to hear what you're seeing.
It's so interesting. I think so similar in many ways. I mean, I think tech companies are navigating, backlash to DEI work in very similar ways to what we're seeing in other industries. I think tech companies face all the, many of the internal hurdles that, we see in other industries. And I think if you've only ever been in tech, I think it's very easy to be like uniquely critical of this industry as maybe worse than others. I think tech companies have a lot of things going for them. I think tech companies have people that are often, in some sense mission driven, that have a belief about making the world different, about being able to shape the world in some way. And I think if you can connect the idea of what it can look like, how they can maybe even accelerate that work if they bring more voices to the table, or if they create cultures that unlock potential. I see people like really kind of compelled by that. I also think, in tech companies, people are often just like very data driven. So when we can show that if you do these things, you'll achieve these kind of outcomes, that tends to sort of motivate people in a way that isn't always translatable to every industry I've worked with. And it's why, I mean, for the first several years at Paradigm, we only worked with tech companies because we started the company with the goal of taking a more data-driven and evidence-based approach to DEI. And that just resonated like immediately especially in the startup world, where we could say, here's what we're going to do. Here's the impact you can expect to see. Here's why you should care about that. And that way of talking just resonated really well in tech. Now, I think you also have an industry of people that can get overconfident that they know better. And that can be a challenge, right? I think, or an industry that has such an allergic reaction sometimes to bureaucracy that when you suggest that a process might help lead to a better outcome, you sometimes have leaders that just have a visceral negative reaction to the concept of process, which those are challenges we don't face so much in other industries. So like pros and cons. I love working with tech companies. I think it's like some of the best clients we've had, some of the best progress we've seen, some of the biggest like success stories just of leaders going from total, apathy on this topic to like really caring deeply and driving people to make progress in their companies. So I love tech, and I think it has all the right ingredients to be able to get really good and really thoughtful about building great cultures that work for everybody.
Yeah. You've mentioned the backlash a couple of times, and I think, Kelli, your hypothesis is really interesting, which is losing patience. Joelle, what else are you hearing about the backlash and why it feels so acute right now?
I think it is hard to pinpoint a single thing, but I think there's a ton of interesting stuff sort of that's culminated in the last year. So I think we had, economic headwinds. So anything that wasn't a top priority for like 18 months in organizations, or like a kind of core business, this is going to drive revenue priority, got deprioritized. We have sort of a multi-decade campaign from extremist groups who, the same groups that want to dismantle voting rights and attack other types of civil rights have set their sights on DEI, and I think are very, very effective in their messaging at telling people that this work is zero sum. It's not about you. It's about helping groups that you're not a part of to your detriment. And I think that messaging is really effective. And I don't think those of us that have been doing this work have had an equally effective counter message. I don't think we've done a very good job clearly explaining what we're doing, why it's good for everyone, what it actually looks like. And then I think you have the affirmative action decision that, while it didn't apply to companies, I think changed the landscape and changed companies' calculus about what they actually even could be doing in this space, probably compounded by patience and just like not seeing a lot of progress that maybe made companies just feel like we can't win. Now this is seeming controversial. Oh, I also think, everything that happened around, October 7th, and then conversations about anti-Semitism on college campuses, DEI being sort of pitted as maybe part of the enemy in all of that. I think just something that probably nobody really expected, but I think just started to put this work of DEI and this acronym into a corner. And again, I think I really wish that we had spent more time in 2020 and 2021, that I had spent more time not just assuming because suddenly this idea was so popular and every company was working on it, that everyone understood it. I think there was just this switch that was flipped, and all of us doing this work were like, oh my gosh, everyone gets it now. Let's like run, let's do it. And I think what I've realized now in hindsight is actually along the way, a lot of people didn't have any idea what we were talking about, and they didn't feel like they could ask questions because there was oftentimes sort of a little bit of like superiority or moral authority in these conversations, where if you ask questions, it's not just like, oh, you don't get it. It's like, you're bad. And I just don't think that's a good way to structure any kind of dialogue. And so I think even about like conversations I had where I'm like, I wonder if I made it harder for people to ask questions in that moment. And I wonder if I'd done that differently, if like we would be in a different place today. So I think there's a lot of factors. I couldn't pin it on one. And I think it's been a very interesting year to try to parse the impact all of these different things have had. But at the end of the day, like the thing that gives us like kind of doom and gloom, I think the thing that gives me optimism is whatever we call this and whatever acronym we give it, I think it's going to become a pretty existential question for companies over the next, decade. Are you able to attract the best employees from all backgrounds? Are you able to create a culture where, people who are different from one another can work together effectively? Are you able to create environments that inspire people, that enable people, that keep your best people? And whatever we call it and however thinking on this evolves, I don't think companies can afford to not care about those things. I think even just the changing workforce demographics make that clear. So I'm optimistic that companies are going to find ways to do this work that are resonant and authentic for them. But I think it's unfortunate that we're having what feels like a massive distraction from that right now with all of the backlash.
Hey everyone, we'll be right back in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Your workforce is both your organization's greatest strength and largest single cost. With Planful, it's easy to unlock the secrets of successful workforce planning so you and your HR team can make the right business decisions. Imagine using data-driven insights to develop accurate forecasts, close hiring gaps, and adjust talent acquisition plans collaboratively based on costs today and into the future. Planful lets you collaborate with colleagues in finance to understand the value your employees bring to the table. And the best part, you can get started with Planful in just weeks with minimal help from IT. Plus, with Planful, you get an endless runway. Planful grows with you, no matter how fast or large your team scales. Ready to transform your HR strategy? Join over 1,500 organizations worldwide who trust Planful as their go-to workforce planning software at planful.com/heretics.
Here's a crazy stat. Between hybrid and frontline employees, about 80% don't typically work in an office. So it's no surprise that digitally engaging employees is the #1 concern for CEOs as companies go hybrid. But as hybrid is quickly becoming the norm, it's easy for workplaces to start feeling a little less human. Yet delighting a digital workforce is possible, and it can even be, dare we say, fun. That's where Workvivo, Zoom's employee experience platform, comes in. If you've ever recoiled at the thought of a static intranet that looks like something you built in 1995 using MS Paint, have no fear. Workvivo is a dynamic, intuitive, accessible, and mobile-first tool. People actually like using it, which is why companies like Ryanair, Dollar General, Virgin, and more have rolled it out to hundreds of thousands of employees. Workvivo's activity feeds, spaces, shoutouts, and live streams, among other features, help elevate the employee experience like never before. The result? Dramatically better retention, productivity, and most importantly, connectedness. A greater sense of the belonging we all crave at work, whether we sit at a desk or drive a truck. Make Workvivo the digital heart of your organization and achieve limitless human connection. Head to workvivo.com to book a demo and make sure you tell them that Nolan and Kelli from HR Heretics sent you.
Yeah. And how has this backlash, or whatever you want to call it, right, the last 6-9 months, I'm really curious, how have you all seen it impact the work you're doing with your clients? Like, is there something that's like, oh my gosh, compared to 4 years ago, this is really different today, or we're having to do these things today that we didn't have to do 4 years ago in a good way, or maybe not so good way?
I think most of the changes for us have been in a good way. And I don't mean to say like, so I'm glad this is happening, but I think it forces us to be far more effective with our messaging. Like we need to spend a lot more time ourselves helping leaders and organizations understand what it is that we're doing and that we think they should be doing. They need to spend more time bringing their employees along. So a lot more time on communications, which I think we should have always been doing. I think we're thinking a lot more about how to do this work, to your point on the kind of patience earlier, like how do we do this work in a way that shows and has more impact? I think, for us, one of the biggest evolutions we've gone through as a company is we started out as a consulting firm, right? And until 2020, that's what we did. And that's what a lot of people know us for. Now, half of our revenue is product revenue. We started building software in 2020 to think about, COVID pushed us to think this way, like, how do we expand our impact? How do we make it more accessible to do this work? And now with kind of the backlash that's been happening, it's allowed us to think like, how do we help our clients do this work far more efficiently? If budgets are lower, if you can't have a diversity people analyst on your team anymore, maybe you actually didn't need that anymore because software can do those things for you. And so it's pushed us to think a lot more about how we can actually enable our clients to do work more efficiently, more impactfully. We have to show our impact to clients more, which I wish they'd always been asking us for because we are really oriented in that way, but I think it's good. I think it's good that organizations are talking in that way. So to the extent that our approach to our work has changed, I think it's all for the positive, with maybe the one kind of carve out being, I started my career before Paradigm as a civil rights lawyer. I litigated employment cases. And, usually when people reach out and they're like in college, they're like, I want to do what you do someday. Should I go to law school? Like for years, I've been like, no, like that's not the most relevant or linear career trajectory. But over the past year, I've had to like really lean more heavily into my background as an employment lawyer and do more advising of companies that are really afraid that, programs that they have that really are, I think, not only totally legally sound, but very important, could be on the chopping block. And I I think, well, I'm glad that I have the background and expertise, and as does another person on my team to advise on that. That's like the one thing that I'm like, ugh, it kind of sucks that we have to be talking now about like whether your mentoring program is legal. Like that's just like time that is not being spent having impact. And that I always just like, I like love maximizing time. So I'm just always frustrated by, ugh, this conversation is like not the best use of time. So that's the one thing that like is a change that I, wish were maybe a bit different.
Yeah, so quickly circling back to just the reasons for the backlash and the hypotheses around that. I think one of the things that you didn't cover is the equity discussion. And that discussion seems to be like at the forefront of what I'm seeing online. And I think equity initially started as equality. And so like we want to treat people the same, we want to treat people fairly. And now it seems like there's a discussion of, well, everyone's starting point is different and we have to factor that in. And that's where I think we're starting to hear other folks saying, well, are we tying a weight to some other people's ankles in order to make sure that that's happening? SHRM, as you know, recently dropped equity from its DEI statement. Now it's just D&I, I believe. And so what's your take on equity and what are your thoughts about that?
I'm so glad you're asking about this. I think it's one of the most misunderstood concepts. So it's really good that we get to talk about it. And I think it's important because I think when we define this clearly, I find most people are actually super aligned that equity is a good thing. And you're right, the way you set it up. Like, I think equity and equality are like two different philosophies about how you achieve fair outcomes in the world. And I think you sort of summarized it, pretty well, right? Equality, the philosophy that if you treat everyone the exact same way, that leads to fair outcomes. Equity, the philosophy that like sometimes that might not be the best way to achieve fair outcomes, and we might need to account for the different ways that people are experiencing the world. So I think, just to be super clear, equity is not about giving one group advantages to the detriment of another. So I think the analogy of like tying a weight to people's ankles is the misunderstanding. And I like that is very much not how I think about it. The way that I think about it, the simplest way, and I think most accurate way to think about it is it's about ensuring that everyone has a fair opportunity to do their best in the context of an organization, to get hired, to get promoted, in the context of life, like to get funded, to get a mortgage, whatever it might mean. And one of the things that I get so sort of excited about when I'm thinking about equity is so many leaders talk about meritocracy and really care about meritocracy. And I've started to see this like idea that maybe these two things are in conflict with one another. But the way that I think about it is equity is actually like a prerequisite to meritocracy. How could we hope to have a meritocratic society, or let's simplify it, meritocratic company, if we have totally unlevel playing fields? If some people, there's this like analogy by Stanford psychology professor Greg Walton that I love. And he says, imagine two runners and, one is racing against a headwind and the other is racing in fair weather, and they finish the race at the same time. Who is the better runner? And obviously we would all agree the person I run, so definitely the person running against the headwind. I feel that. Now, taking that into the context of a real organization, I think the question is, how would you operationalize that? Like, is it time, putting a headwind in front of the person that has the fair weather? But I think the question is like, how do we create organizational kind of structures where people have a fair opportunity to do their best work, so that we as an organization have the opportunity to really make sure we're hiring the best person, promoting the best person. So I'll give you an example, and this is one I've shared a couple of times recently. I think it's like such a perfect example of equity, and it's a real example from a tech startup we worked with a couple of years back. This company was growing quickly, and they found that candidates who were referred to the company made it through their hiring process at much higher rates than candidates who came in any other way. It's a very common story in many companies, tech companies in particular. And there are a lot of reasons why that might be true. But one hypothesis that we had, that they had also, is that maybe referral candidates have more information than non-referrals about what to expect in a hiring process and how to perform well. That knowledge might create an unlevel playing field that allows candidates that are not actually better to perform better. And that deprives the company of access to the best candidate. It's not equitable, not a meritocracy, doesn't find the best person for the job. So an equity-minded approach would be to acknowledge this is not a level playing field and it's not in anyone's best interest. And ideally, although this is an area where you could have debates like, okay, we can acknowledge it's uneven, what should a company actually do about it? But ideally, try to do something about it if you reasonably can. So in this case, what the company did is they created an overview of their hiring process with what candidates could expect. They included sample interview questions that they've asked in the past, just more depth of information about the types of things they're assessing for. Guess what happened? It worked, right? The gap between referred and non-referred candidates shrunk. Is that discrimination? No. Is that communism? Which is, I'm increasingly hearing people like worry that equity is communism. Like, obviously not, right? This is a smart decision the company made to give itself the best shot at hiring the best people by acknowledging that people have different starting points and proactively solving for that. And I also think it's important to be clear that equity is not like some newfangled like fad or like leftist concept. There's so many areas of society where we have already all kind of collectively agreed, or most of us, that an equity-minded approach makes sense. We acknowledge in many areas that people experience the world differently and we do something about it. So we give parental leave to people who have kids. And if I'm sitting next to a colleague and I didn't just have a kid and that colleague has a kid, might I say it's not fair that I don't get to take 3 months leave right now? I mean, maybe, but like we've kind of decided that you're experiencing the world differently than that person. We're going to treat you differently. We give parking spaces closer to a building for disabled people. We allow military service members to board airplanes early in gratitude for their service. And these are things that I think people could disagree about. But I think mostly when I talk to people, they're like, most people are aligned that like, I might disagree with what it looks like to give someone a fair opportunity or the best way to achieve that. But the idea, whether that's a reasonable goal, I don't find it all that controversial. And I think, one way to know if we've created that at a societal level or even in a company level is, do we see pretty consistent outcomes, not by individuals? It's not that you and I, if we get hired at the same time, should experience the company in the same way, but in aggregate, do we see that race, gender, sexual orientation, age, do these things predict the outcomes you're going to experience in an organization or do they not? And I think if we can try to build more equitable processes and systems, my gender or the fact that I'm a mom is not going to be predictive of how I'm going to do in an organization. Instead, my success in a company, in life, is going to be determined by ability, by effort, by resilience, by a good bit of luck. And I think we'd all rather have those things be the biggest predictors of success rather than like the identity you were born into. And that's what I think equity is about. And I think when we talk about it in that way, I rarely have found someone be like, that's not a good idea.
Hey everyone, we'll be right back in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Real talk, most talent leaders haven't yet cracked how to leverage AI for meaningful impact on their hiring processes and business goals. But the leaders who are effectively using AI to transform their recruiting team's efficiency and quality use Metaview. Metaview is the AI assistant for the interview process. Their AI records and transcribes hiring conversations, like intakes, interviews, and debriefs, then provides perfectly summarized notes of everything that was discussed. That means your people can focus on creating human connections with candidates during calls and save time on the busy work of cleaning up notes after every interview. But it's so much more than just a time saver, because perfect notes means perfect data. For every candidate in every pipeline, hiring teams can make confident, informed decisions, and talent leaders can finally take control of the interview process. Join forward-thinking talent leaders at high-performing organizations like Brex, HelloFresh, and Quora, and check out Metaview. Head over to metaview.ai/heretics to talk to one of Metaview's product experts, or get started for free. You'll be up, running, and AI-enabled in minutes.
This episode is brought to you by Warp. If you're a founder with employees in multiple states, you know managing state tax compliance is complicated. Warp not only automates state tax compliance, but also offers a user-friendly experience tailored to the needs of startups with a robust in-house team of experts. Warp ensures your startup remains compliant across all 50 states, giving you the peace of mind you need to focus on scaling your business. They also make it easy for startups to provide health benefits for employees, hire international contractors, and even claim R&D tax credits. Hundreds of startups trust Warp to handle their payroll and compliance needs. You can go from zero to payroll live in just 2 days. Don't let payroll and compliance hold your startup back. Visit joinwarp.com/peel or tap the link in the description. Get started and receive a $1,000 gift card when you run your very first payroll. That's joinwarp.com/peel.
Yeah, I love what you said about equity being a prerequisite to meritocracy. I think that's a very elegant and simple way to sum that up. Could not agree more.
Yeah, the analogy for folks that are disabled and military veterans is a really good one. I find though that that is like, that's the most rational argument I've heard for equity, and like should be framed, in the Hall of Fame for how to describe it. But I don't find that that's actually like how it is widely shared more publicly. And so that's where I think that's where I think there is that's where the friction lies.
What do you mean by that, Nolan?
I was just going to give an example. Yeah. So an example would be, if you talk to any executive recruiter, they will absolutely tell you they have talked to a client that has said, we must hire insert race or gender for this role. Any executive recruiter who has worked with a tech company in the last 5 to 10 years will say that that's happened. And that's where I think things have gotten off the rails. And there hasn't been a course correction to say that that is not okay. Like, that is not what we want. And so that's where I think like it really comes down into the what and the how. I think the why, Joelle, you just nailed, but the what and the how is where we're in a turbulent time, and the what and the how has gotten away from us. Do you agree with that?
So I am not going to gaslight you or anyone that says that they've heard those things happening. If you've heard those things happening, they're happening. Like, I haven't heard a company say that, but I believe you. And you talk to executive recruiters all the time. So if you've heard it, I'm sure it is. And like, I'm sure whether or not I've heard of those particular things, I've definitely seen examples of like this work being done in ways that are, at best, like weird, and at worst, like not legal. Like the thing you just described, like that's not legal. And that hasn't been legal to do that type of thing in companies for a long time. So the way that I think about it is, first of all, like saying something like that would not only be illegal, it wouldn't be sort of a manifestation of equity. It seems like a lazy approach to sort of giving up on the idea that we could design better systems and processes it's like, we just want to fast forward to the end. We don't want to build processes and skills for making our company more attractive to more people. We don't want to do the work to cast a wide talent net. We don't want to build a more fair hiring process so that we actually have a better shot at evaluating people fairly. We just want to like fast forward and like engineer the outcome. And I think that what matters so much are the inputs. Once you get towards that end, you cannot engineer the outcome. And I think a lot of companies have failed to do all the work to figure out how to cast a wide net, to figure out how to evaluate people fairly. And so they're like, man, like we just keep hiring men. And then they go to their executive recruiter, it sounds like, and say, we need a woman for this role. And it's like, well, yeah, like you have a problem, but that's not the right solution. Like, you've identified a real problem and that's not the right solution. So I mean, I've heard stories. I was working with an executive team not too long ago, and I heard a story about, a big tech company they'd been working at previously where, there was some mandate on promotions and we could only promote people from certain backgrounds. And I haven't worked with that company. I don't know if that's true, but like, again, those are the types of things that are not only like bad policy, I think they communicate the exact opposite of what we should be talking about when we talk about this work. And when I say I feel like we've done a bad job communicating about what this is, you said that's the best, explanation, whatever you've heard. It's like, it's not, I actually like don't think my view on what equity is very unique among people that do this work. I think we need to get better at talking about it and explaining it. And then definitely we need to get better at the what and the how, because that's going to lead people to think equity is bad if they hear you can't promote your top performer because they are XYZ identity, or we can't, we have to hire someone because of their identity.
I've heard that in the ether multiple times, like in my career, which is unfortunate. And I think I've used the term lazy in a previous episode, but this like pattern of shortcuts to get around something that you view as hard work or a distraction. Like, this is what happens, especially when people are kind of under pressure or they don't really care about the work, et cetera. And that's really unfortunate, which leads me to kind of a spicy question, Joelle. I can't imagine you all would do this, but I have to ask, like, have you ever assessed someone that wants to work with you and you're like, listen, you can't be helped. Like, I'm firing you, or I'm not going to even try, because it's like that ridiculous that you're just trying to check a box, or you don't get it, or you're trying to take a shortcut. Like, I had to ask because
I mean, totally. We have I like want our business to grow and be as big as possible. So it's painful for me, when this happens, but from like a revenue standpoint, but we've turned down clients and we have fired clients, where the way that I think about it is our first core value as a company is to prioritize impact. And so we are always thinking about that. We don't want to do things that are performative. We want to do things that actually work. And so we have to make sure for us to be successful against our OKRs that we're working with companies where that can be true. And so we have had to do that before. It doesn't like feel good. I'm not like, oh, we're good and you're bad and we're like firing you. It feels awful and I hate it. And we've had to do it a handful of times. It's the worst thing and it sucks. And I sometimes hope like, please come back to us if like you think about things differently in the future. Like there's not personal. It's just like, we don't believe we can do what we do best. And if you find someone that can do what they do best and help you, great. Like it's like, it's like a bummer when that happens for me.
Yeah. And firings are hard. I mean, we tend to be a little bit exaggerative on the show, but that's what's, I will love you all. It's always been real. It's always been authentic. And to that question, because I've had this conversation multiple times over the past like 10 years or so, like in the next generation of this work and when companies are doing it well and we're making a lot of progress, do you think a dedicated DEI person or team is necessary? Because I will tell you, I've had in almost all of my, early stage companies and leading people, I've had DEI teams. And then one company I actually didn't backfill the person. And this was like in 2016. So I got a lot of backlash. It was at Hired. And I went up in front of a town hall and I explained to the company why I wasn't backfilling the role. And that was probably some of the most successful DEI work I've done in my career at Hired. So I'm just curious, maybe both of you, do you think this role or this team will be necessary when this is kind of done correctly in the future, or done better, I should say?
So I have like a complex assortment of thoughts on this. I think I don't have I'm not like a staunch believer that like you must have or you must not have. I actually think some of this depends on other leaders you have in place, org structure, like other factors. I think that some things that we know are important. I think having subject matter expertise inform your work is really important. Do you have to have that from an internal headcount? Not necessarily. There are probably other ways to get that. I think it's really important that someone is sort of owning the sort of roll up of your strategy. Now that's different from owning the execution of your strategy, right? Because like if you have a leader or even a team, they're not the ones hiring, writing performance reviews, running meetings that make people feel either, good or bad about your culture. But like all those things should, I think, roll up into like one strategy. And it could be a part of your culture or people or talent strategy, but you should have a line of sight into like, who are we hiring? How are people feeling here? Who are we promoting? And I think having an owner of that type of thing, like can make sense. I also think there could be ways you could structure your org to do all of that without someone with that title. Might be more challenging. But what I think organizations have often done wrong when they've brought in DEI leaders or entire teams is, and I alluded to this earlier, like not been honest with themselves about what those teams could possibly accomplish and not set those teams up for success because you're holding them accountable for metrics that they literally are not the decision makers of. And that's just like a weird misalignment. So, I think it can work. I think it doesn't have to work. And then, there's a lot of debate about, okay, if you have that person, who should they report into? Most people that do work in this space say it has to be the CEO. I like very much don't feel that way. People are like, it can't, wherever it is, it can't be HR. I'm like, probably like it should be HR. Like 80% of things you do map to HR and like maybe 20% don't, but like not everyone can report to the CEO. Like you need an org structure. So I have just like, I think I've seen organizations that have structured this work differently. And I've seen organizations with a CDO and a DEI team that make no progress. I've seen organizations with a CDO and DEI team who could not have made progress but for that team. So I think I do think it depends.
Totally.
I have a take on echo chambers that I want your feedback on. So what you're saying is so logical, so non-emotional, just like, honestly, like it makes sense. Yet I feel like what ends up happening online is we end up in this echo chamber and we amplify our thinking, which then doesn't get stress tested by people who may disagree with us. Then when something pierces the echo chamber, it becomes like vitriolic. It becomes like this bomb that explodes in the thing versus let's go have a conversation like the one that we're having right now. I don't know how we break this cycle other than conversations like this. But I think that this is one of the biggest problems in our society today. I think it's one of the biggest problems as we just specifically talk about companies and how they're thinking about DEI, is that there isn't actually a conversation going on. This is the right thing to do, and this is the wrong thing to do. Do you see that the way that I see that in online and in our communities?
Totally. I mean, yes, I think social media makes it so much harder. I've been guilty of this at times. Like, I think it's very hard. I mean, I have so many thoughts. I think at the end of the day, like, as humans, we all want to belong. Like, the sense of belonging is one of the most important things to our like emotional well-being. And I think that sort of like hive mentality gives people a sense of belonging. It feels like I know where I belong because you are my people and you are not. And like it creates clarity that we all have a team that we can go to. And like if I see everyone getting mad at this person, I do that too. And that's how I continue my sense of belonging in this community. And so I think it's like human nature to seek out a sense of belonging. And I think in the world that we live in, like one of the fastest and easiest ways to find that is to figure out to like glom on to like some clear community. And I will just, a personal anecdote is just since October 7th, I'm Jewish. And like, it's been very hard for me to figure out where do I belong because I don't agree with anything anybody is saying. And it's just been like, and it's been jarring. And I've like wanted that sense of belonging, but I've not felt like I align with any clear kind of extreme. But going to an extreme, man, it really is comforting once you get there because people welcome you with open arms. They want you there. And so I think it's tough to break out of that. I also think, in the space that we're in, I think good faith dialogue and debate is so healthy and so important. But I think we're in a space where there have been bad faith actors for so long coming with things that might sound like reasonable questions, but with a true intent to dismantle this work. And I think for those of us doing this work, it can be hard to know who's who and to know, like, are you asking questions because you really like want to build a great organization, or are you asking questions because you don't think I deserve to be here, or you don't think women are as smart or whatever? And so I think it takes a certain like vulnerability, I guess, to be able to engage in good faith dialogue and hope that the person on the other side of that is truly acting and asking questions in good faith. And that can be hard sometimes. It can be hard for me. I think it can be hard for everybody. And so I don't know what the answer is, but I agree with the problem. I try very, very hard to like always start from the assumption that a person asking a question simply doesn't have the same exact context and worldview as I do. And that like, I always try to say like, if this person were asking this question in good faith, and if I assume that it's a rational question, what might be leading them to ask it? And so I try to do that. But, sometimes people ask questions that I can't do that with, and they may very much be operating in good faith, but it just doesn't feel like it to me. And so it's hard. And I don't know. It's being a human is so tricky.
It's so tricky. I struggle with a lot of the things you just said as well, especially as it relates to DEI, and the work and what's success and what's not. And I often end up with like the best progress I've seen in my career around this is in these conversations. It's not like three people agreeing at the end. It's actually the journey of just wrestling and thinking about other points of view, even if you disagree, and then accepting those and then sharing yours, and other people are open, even if they don't agree. I mean, that's some of the best progress I've seen. It's not in, everyone landing on the same space. It's just.
Yeah, I think Tim Urban calls it intellectual sparring. I think that's the phrase that he uses. And that deeply resonates with me because I want to toss ideas into the ring. And and especially like publicly, when we put the ideas into the ring, let's evaluate the ideas, to use the term merit, which I know is a little bit loaded, but that's the only thing that's coming to my mind right now is like on their merits versus, online, what I see a lot of is ad hominem. And I find that as soon as ad hominem is brought into the conversation, if ad hominem is being used, I feel like the argument's being lost because we're not elevating to logic. And that's what I really enjoyed about this conversation so far, Joelle. I have one more question, which is on the trade-off of DEI investments. So, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this problem. I've been in recruiting my entire career. And what I've always said is that it will take longer to expand the pipeline. It will take longer for us from a time horizon standpoint to do the right work as it relates to especially top of funnel generation to ensure that it is representative. Do you agree with that? Like, do you agree that the other side of like the trade-off is moving a little bit slower in order to get better outcomes?
Yeah. And I think obviously so, right? Like if everyone could just like do everything as fast and like I think every company, if they could magically snap their fingers and be more diverse, they would. Like there are trade-offs. You have to slow down if you're going to have to build new, funnels of talent and identify new people and go to different places. That is effort and it will take time. And so I think, for example, if companies want to become more diverse, I think reducing their, benchmarking of success around time to hire might be something they need to do. And I think every company, what I see our job as sort of experts that come in and help companies with is not telling them like to do that. It's helping them understand that and then allowing them to make the smartest choices in the best interest of their company. And I think slowing down might sometimes just like literally not be the trade-off you can make at that time. And maybe though, you can invest in some other things that are not going to be at odds with hiring, and you can put in some other infrastructure so that the people you do bring in have better experiences. Or maybe you say, well, what we don't want to do is 2x the size of our company, look back and realize like, crap, we haven't hired anyone from, XYZ backgrounds. And now we're 400 people and we don't have any women or whatever it is. Like that's going to make it harder to do. And we know that it's going to deprive us of the best people in the future because they're not going to want to join us. Like there are different ways to like weigh that. But I think every company should think about it as having upsides and trade-offs and figure out what makes sense for them.
And that's super helpful. And it's amazing to hear it from you because I feel like, a lot of leaders want to say, no, it's we do this and we move as fast as we've always moved. And I feel like it's always been a false choice because you have to objectively look at the trade-offs. The other thing I was thinking about was, I believe it's like the New York Symphony and how they do the blind auditions, right? So like when you're doing the violin, right, we can't see you. Like we completely remove any appearance about you. And it turned out like, as if I recall the study correctly, that it didn't look very diverse with those results. That process feels like the most meritocratic that there is. Again,
no, it did. It dramatically changed their hiring into the symphony. Well, first they just put the curtain up, and then they found that people could still know if it was a man or woman by the sound of their shoes on the stage. So they had to change that too. But no, when they were able to successfully de-identify people, it did have a huge positive impact.
Okay, so I'm looking at the New York Times article right now, which says to make orchestras more diverse and blind auditions.
Well, I don't know what the person.
Okay, because I remember reading that and being like, wait, hold on, isn't this like the best possible input process that we could have?
So here's the tricky thing. Maybe there's some updated study, so I'll Google that afterward. The original study found that had a significant positive impact. Now, a lot of companies will extrapolate that and say, like, should we have totally de-identified hiring processes? And I don't think it's that simple. And the only meta-analysis that's ever been done that's looked at that has found that it backfired. I think one reason is it does prevent companies who are proactively trying to diversify from doing that, right? Like we're not going to be able to proactively source, from particular underrepresented, clubs or groups or colleges and universities. That is actually something that's pretty helpful. And I think one of the other things that backfires is that only works in the context of a hiring process at like the earliest resume review stage. And that's not where we typically see the biggest disparities emerge anyway. It's when you ultimately meet with people. And so it just you might see that you close some gaps in the resume review stage, and those gaps are just like way larger than when you actually interview a candidate and all the biases can come out. So, but I'm going to look at that article because I haven't heard, anything about that. But when they originally ran that study, it did have a huge positive impact in closing the gender representation gap in the symphony.
Awesome. Kelli, anything else from you?
I asked all mine. Some of them were off script, so appreciate you, Joelle. Thank you so much for being here. This is fun.
Yeah, Joelle, I really just appreciate the dialogue and you willing to engage in the conversation and going deep with us. I think our audience is really going to enjoy this conversation, and especially just that like people with different perspectives can come together and just talk like adults. And I wish we could do more of that in our society.
I love it. Well, start with us, and then we'll, hope it ripples out over the next few months. But no, I really appreciate it. I love the questions, and I think it's good to talk about this stuff, and it's more fun with people that don't already see it all the same way. Like that's where you get like pressure testing of your ideas, and maybe it's the lawyer in me. I don't think everyone's personality, like I like that sort of thing, but like I like that's just like that might be a personality quirk as well. But I really appreciated it, and yeah, excited to continue to hear all your other great conversations with other HR leaders. So I think that's just going to help us like really wrap our heads around what is the future of work going to look like and where does inclusion fit into it. So thank you for everything you both are doing.
Thanks so much, Joelle. HR Heretics, it's a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Econ 102, Moment of Zen, and Turpentine VC. Subscribe, 5 stars, share it on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, all the things.